Welcome to this November edition of the Cambridge Café Scientifique podcast, sponsored by the Medical Research Council. I'm Mira Senthilingam from The Naked Scientists. This month, Professor Tony Holland from the Department of Psychiatry at the University of Cambridge spoke at the Café about his research on learning disabilities. Tony focused on relationships between certain genetic disorders and the learning disabilities and behavioural problems that come with them.
Well, my background, I'm a psychiatrist, and as a psychiatrist, my specialty is seeing people with learning disabilities, what used to be called mental handicap in the past. And of course, the challenge for psychiatrists is to understand the emotional and behavioural states of people with learning disabilities, and this can be difficult. So the research I'm talking about today is research that we've been doing that looks at the relationship between people who are born with very specific genetic syndromes associated with learning disability and some of the problem behaviours that appear to be rather unique to those syndromes. And I'm going to use examples of Prader-Willi syndrome and Down syndrome to illustrate this.
So maybe if we start with Down syndrome to start with, because people have heard of that really. So what are you really looking into with regard to this?
Yes. I mean, Down syndrome is the commonest single cause of learning disability. There's a lot of people with Down syndrome, and one of the big advances has been that they have a much better life expectancy than they used to. They still have a shorter life expectancy, but it's much better. And what we're now seeing is some of the problems of old age associated with Down syndrome. And this is primarily a very high risk for Alzheimer's disease. So they are probably the most at-risk group for developing Alzheimer's disease relatively early in life. So the research I'm just going to briefly touch on, which is funded by the Medical Research Council, is to try and understand why people with Down syndrome get Alzheimer's disease, and ultimately, can you prevent it?
Are there any figures for, how much more likely they are to get Alzheimer's?
Yes, I mean, if you look at the prevalence rate, it like in the general population, it increases with age. In people with Down syndrome, this risk is brought forward by about 30 or 40 years. So maybe 1 or 2% of people with Down syndrome will develop Alzheimer's disease in their 30s, perhaps 10 or 15% in their 40s, and maybe up to 50% in their 50s.
Do you have any insight so far as to why this happens?
There are theories as to why the Alzheimer's disease may be particularly common, and that relates to a particular gene which is on chromosome 21 called the amyloid precursor protein gene. But I don't think that's the full story. I think there is something about premature aging in people with Down syndrome. And we also have other projects that are trying to look at that, whether there's an explanation for why people with Down syndrome seem to age sooner and perhaps more rapidly than the general population.
And I guess is the aim here to really understand more in order to try and slow down the progression to get it?
Absolutely. I mean, Alzheimer's disease is a really horrible illness. I mean, it's devastating. Very much our long-term intention would be to see if we can understand this risk and what the mechanism is that underpins this risk. Then treatments may be developed that could be given to prevent the Alzheimer's disease developing in the first place.
Now, you also mentioned a second syndrome, which is Prader-Willi syndrome, which is much more rare in the community.
Yes, Prader-Willi syndrome is much rarer. We think it's about 1 in 25,000 births. And this is, again, another genetic syndrome associated with mild learning disabilities. But the focus of my talk is going to be on 3 aspects of the syndrome and 3 behavioural aspects. The first is this very high risk of overeating behaviour that, if it's not managed, leads to gross obesity, life-threatening obesity. The second is a long-standing problem with temper outbursts, which cause lots of problems and associated with often obsessional and ritualistic behaviours. And the third area is a high risk of mood disorder and psychotic illness. So here's an example of a syndrome in which there are really 3 particular, what one might loosely call behaviours or psychiatric problems that seem really uniquely associated with this syndrome. So there must be something about the genetics of Prader-Willi syndrome that in some way affects the brain, which then in turn leads to these behaviours and to these psychiatric disorders.
What actually causes a syndrome? Is it a genetic mutation?
There are really two main genetic causes that give rise to the syndrome. One is a deletion or a loss of a small part of chromosome 15. But interestingly, that deletion has to be on the chromosome 15 of paternal origin. If it's on the mother's chromosome 15, you get a completely different syndrome called Angelman syndrome. And this has led people to appreciate that whatever the gene is, and we don't really know what the gene is yet, that is absent, it is what's known as imprinted. And whether it's expressed or not depends upon the gender of the parent of origin. It illustrates very clearly this new science of what's called epigenetics.
Now, epigenetics is really, I guess, the end kind of behaviour or actual effects of these mutations within the gene, so the kind of resulting outcome of it.
That's right. I mean, epigenetics really is everything that happens after the DNA. So it's really what I think the geneticists are appreciating is that is where the interest really lies now. What is it that determines whether a gene expresses or not? But in Prader-Willi syndrome, whatever the gene or genes are that's not expressed, that are located on chromosome 15, there's clearly an epigenetic process there that is switching it off on the mother's chromosome quite normally. So it's normally the father's copy of the gene that is expressed. If that's lost because of a deletion, then you have no copy that's being expressed. The other genetic cause of Prader-Willi syndrome is when both copies of chromosome 15 are inherited from the mother and you don't have a copy from the father. And because of this imprinting process, both copies of the gene or genes that's important for Prader-Willi syndrome are imprinted and switched off quite naturally because they come from the mother. And therefore you also have Prader-Willi syndrome. The interesting point, I think, is that whilst both causes, genetic causes of Prader-Willi syndrome, give the syndrome of Prader-Willi, if you like, there are important differences, one of which is that this risk of psychotic illness tends to be much more common in those with the second and the less common cause. That's what's called the disomy cause, where both copies are inherited from the mother. So that then pushes you into a different direction as to what the genetic underpinning of the psychotic illness is. And it's this, in a way, that's the window on the biology of behaviour.
So this is extremely complicated, so many aspects and so many different genetic kind of causes behind it. What perhaps have been some of your key findings to date whilst looking into this?
Right. I think what we've learned is that we need to conceptualise the problem of the eating disorder in a different way. And one of the papers I'm going to briefly touch on is a hypothesis paper that we wrote in which we talked about the paradox of Prader-Willi syndrome. Prader, when he described it, talked about it being a syndrome of obesity. We now think of it as a syndrome of starvation, in that the brain is fooled into thinking that the person hasn't eaten. So they behave, and their physical phenotype is of a person that's starved, except, of course, they live in a food-rich environment, and they do eat. So their hunger, their lack of satiety, are all exactly what you and I would experience if we didn't eat for 24 hours or 48 hours. The fact that they have low growth hormone and low sex hormone levels are what you see in people in chronic states of starvation. Now, this is a contentious idea, but for me, as a clinician, it's helped me reconsider the advice you give and the support you give to people with Prader-Willi syndrome. And at present, the strategies in terms of the eating problem is to control access to food. We can't as yet switch off the hunger and stop the eating. But what we can do is, through supervision, is prevent the gross overeating and therefore the life-threatening obesity. Now, it does, of course, raise ethical dilemmas. What right do you have to stop an adult with Prader-Willi syndrome having access to food?
Because they must feel like they really need it.
They very much feel they need it. Although, interestingly, I think our experience is that in many ways, they're much more comfortable if you take over responsibility of food. And I want you, if you imagine that you're starving because you're having surgery and you have to go without food, you're better off being kept away from food. If food is sitting in front of you on the table and you're hungry, it's very hard to resist. So there are houses for people with Prader-Willi syndrome in which the kitchen is locked and so on.
And so what will be your concluding comments, I guess, this evening for the audience to really go home with about these two syndromes?
Right. Well, There is a third syndrome that I will touch on right at the beginning of my talk, and that's a syndrome called Lesch-Nyhan syndrome. And I touch on that because that, in a sense, set up this whole idea that genetic syndromes are associated with very particular and sometimes rather unusual behaviours. So what I hope people will see is that these syndromes do genuinely provide a window on the biology of behaviour, because where a particular behaviour, overeating, or a particular risk, like for psychotic illness, is associated with a specific syndrome, then it can't be the environment that accounts for that. There must be something about the way the genes affect the brain. So you almost certainly have a single major cause of whatever the problem is that occurs in all people with that particular syndrome. So it's a very powerful model for looking at the problem, overeating. In the general population, the problem is that there may be many causes for obesity. In the Prader-Willi population, there may be only one major cause. If we can understand that, we can then ask the question, is that relevant to obesity in the general population? And the same would be true for mood disorder or psychotic illness or for Alzheimer's disease when thinking about Down syndrome.
Tony Holland from the University of Cambridge. Now, Tony's research on such different genetic syndromes and their uses in understanding our genes and behaviours on a wider scale sparked a lot of interest with the audience, who had plenty of questions in the latter part of the event, starting with a desire to know the roles of the genes responsible for Prader-Willi syndrome.
So the question here is, do we know exactly what the genes are in Prader-Willi syndrome? If we do, what do they do? And in a way, what's the implications of that for helping the people in the general population in terms of their overeating? What we don't strictly know, I mean, first of all, there's a debate about whether it's one gene or more than one gene that is not expressed at that chromosome 15 site that when it's not expressed leads to Prader-Willi syndrome. My own belief is that it may well be one gene, but at present there are a number of candidate genes at that site. But we haven't found a person in which only one gene is knocked out, but they have Prader-Willi syndrome. So I think at the moment there is uncertainty about it, and therefore there is uncertainty about exactly what it does.
And one audience member didn't quite understand why people with Prader-Willi have such violent outbursts.
So it's the issue of why do they act violently, particularly at meal times or with change. I think the answer to that is probably that they don't have the cognitive ability, they don't have the ability to change from one task to another in the way that most people do. And I think we generally take for granted the ability. I mean, people jokingly say that women can multitask and men can't, but we all have this ability, by and large, to move from one task to another. For someone with Prader-Willi syndrome, they seem to get very fixed on a particular task. There's a video that Chris Oliver made of a young person with Prader-Willi syndrome playing a game, and then the researcher changes the rule, and the person gets really uptight about that. They just can't tolerate the fact that the rule has been changed. And they say things like, you promised me that this would be how we were going to play this game. You promised me this, you promised me that. And I think they just can't shift. It's not their fault. It's not a criticism of them. They just don't have the ability to do that.
And what about the brain activity responsible for a patient's never-ending hunger?
Now, we're quite good at detecting when we're hungry and when we're full. And so we argued that in Prader-Willi syndrome, that when they eat, what happens is they don't switch. The brain areas that are activated in hunger do not switch to the brain areas that are activated when you're full. That was our hypothesis. And we were able to show in the control population that, yes, different areas of the brain were activated when you had eaten a lot of food and you were thinking about food than when you're hungry. So we asked, did the same happen in Prader-Willi syndrome? And the first thing we found was that the areas associated with hunger were overactive, so it appears as if they were more hungry. I think one has to be a little careful about that. But then the most striking thing we found is the areas of the brain, particularly the orbitofrontal cortex, were not activated in conditions when they should have been activated. So, one of the conditions was they had 1,200 calories. Now, we gave it as a disguised load, and I tried it, And again, my wife, I'm sure, will tell you this, I have a good appetite. And after a bit, I couldn't eat anymore. I felt so full, and it was probably the first time in my life I'd felt full. I felt really full. So there was something very powerful about so many calories. But for people with Prader-Willi syndrome, they would eat more. They would go on and eat it. I mean, they're obviously not, the brain is not responding to the food intake. So they're getting no messages that says, I'm full, stop eating. If you didn't control access to food, they would eat and eat and eat. Now, they may stop for a while. It does look as if eventually, I mean, what we found in that original study is they had to eat 3 times more calories compared to the control group to rate themselves as no longer feeling hungry. And then what we found, within 20 minutes or so after stopping eating, they were rating themselves as feeling as hungry as I've ever felt before. So I think for parents, nowadays you have very early diagnosis. Parents, of course, struggle initially with getting their baby to eat enough. I mean, that's the tragedy and the irony of it. But the parents know that around 2 or 3 years of age, there's going to be a switch. And so the parents are advised to manage food very carefully at that point. So in a sense, what you're doing is providing external regulation. One of the dangers, interestingly, is that some parents are over-strict. So you see some children with Prader-Willi syndrome who are really rather skinny, and most now have growth hormone supplements. So they're growing. If you don't have a dietitian involved, often the calorie issues are not properly addressed. So that can be a problem. The difficulty is, whilst they have learning disabilities, they are capable of relatively independent living. They go to school, they become an adult, they move away from home. What happens? Well, that's exactly what that graph shows. So what is your responsibility there? Now you try and engage with them and get their consent to live in an environment where the kitchen remains locked. And there are houses specifically for people with Prader-Willi syndrome. But some might say, yeah, I'm not going to live there. I don't want to live there. I can manage it myself. And so there is an issue, what should you do about it? What is your duty? What are the ethical issues around that? But in truth, if you don't manage it, they will eat. And there is there is quite a significantly increased morbidity and mortality rate. They get diabetes, they get the sleep apnea problems from obesity, and so on, because of the severe overeating and obesity. If you could control the eating behaviour, you would radically improve their quality of life.
Many were curious why the hypothalamus region of the brain seemed to play a role in the learning disabilities associated with Prader-Willi syndrome.
Now, what has the hypothalamus got to do with learning disabilities? And I think you've put your finger on a real dilemma here, because the hypothalamus is a tiny, tiny nucleus in the centre of the brain. It's really concerned with regulation of appetite, but with temperature regulation, with growth hormone and sex hormones and so on. So how do you explain the mild learning disability? The answer is, I don't think we know, and I don't think anyone's really looked at it. We put forward a theory that I don't think anyone believes, but that is part of our starvation hypothesis. And we wonder whether the fetus with Prader-Willi syndrome is actually in a state of starvation. So they're not getting the nutrition, because we know that imprinted genes, the genes that are affected in Prader-Willi syndrome, will of course be absent in the placenta, in the fetal component of the placenta. So it may well be there is a problem with energy transfer. Now there would be a compensatory mechanism there, but our thought may be something to do with that. The other thing is that there are growth hormone receptors in the brain. What about the growth hormone? Is it possible that the lack or the relative lack of growth hormone might have an influence on brain development? So I think you've put your finger on a really intriguing question. And if you're going to take a very reductionist approach to Prader-Willi syndrome, the question has to be, is there a single major cause for all the phenomena of Prader-Willi syndrome? Because what geneticists will argue, well, maybe there's another gene in that area that is expressed in the brain or is not expressed in the brain in Prader-Willi syndrome. So quite independent of the eating or anything else.
And lastly, just how do these various syndromes, genes and brain regions all come together?
The question you're getting at here, that I've raised the whole issue of Alzheimer's disease and Down syndrome and the issue of can you treat that? I mean, I think if you're getting at the issue of treatment, I think where we're at in this whole area of what I've called the behavioural phenotypes, or this window that I've talked about, is that we now understand within the individual syndromes, and it's not just these two syndromes, there's Fragile X syndrome, Williams syndrome, Cornelia de Lange syndrome, Cri-du-Chat syndrome, the whole number of genetic syndromes with their unique genetics that appear to have a phenotype, both behaviour and physical, that is rather specific to that syndrome. And so those relationships are now quite well characterised in all these syndromes. For example, people with Fragile X syndrome, which they get learning disabilities, it's predominantly males. They have severe social anxiety, for example. We know that. Where research has shifted now is to the mechanism that links the genetic abnormality to the behaviour. And that's, I think, what the message of this talk is that there's something very powerful at using these syndromes to explore that relationship. How is it that when genes are not expressed, or in the case of Down syndrome, overexpressed certain genes, how is it that then leads to a particular psychiatric problem or a particular behaviour or whatever? If you can understand the mechanism, say it relates to some sort of oxytocin abnormality in the brain, then if you could replace oxytocin, would you change the behaviour? And it takes us away from the rather negative view that when you have a genetic syndrome, there isn't anything you can do about it because it's genetic. It moves us into the idea that if you can understand the brain mechanism, maybe, despite the fact you can't change the genetics, you may be able to change certain rather important aspects of the phenotype, particularly the behavioural aspects. And it's the behavioural aspects that make life very difficult for people with the syndromes and for their families.
Tony Holland from the University of Cambridge. The intrigue sparked in the audience by Tony's talk was evident when I spoke to a few of them after the event.
I basically thought it was very informative, something that I didn't really know much about. And Professor Holland actually gave it in a very digestible form.
Is there anything in particular that took your attention?
Mainly about the whole aspect of different genetic syndromes and how they are seen at the moment and how they're managed, and what are the current research progression regarding these kind of...
It was very interesting, especially about the aspect of Alzheimer's disease prevalence in Down syndrome. It was good to have an insight on that topic, and there's a correlation between obviously Alzheimer's disease in general population and in Down syndrome, and the same applies to Prader-Willi syndrome, which is mainly due to overeating, and you can obviously relate that back to general population overeating these days as well, and the major problem with obesity. So it's good to know.
I really sort of agree with the point that Tony made about just because it's genetic syndrome, it doesn't mean you can't do anything about it. I think that applies to a lot more people in the general population than just people with these specific syndromes. Because, although you can't change the genetics, it's really important that people understand that there are things that can be done treatment-wise to help people with these syndromes.
So a research area with a wide range of potential insight and applications that kept the audience listening to every word Tony said on the night. So quite a successful event. Now, that's it for this month's podcast. But if you'd like to attend a Café Scientifique yourself, the next event will be in the new year, 2012, and details can soon be found online at cambridgecafescientifique.com. Cambridge Café Scientifique is sponsored by the Medical Research Council, and this podcast was produced by me, Mira Senthilingam, from thenakedscientist.com.